The gods of the Elder Scrolls are potentially the most important factor in how the world of Nirn plays out. Gods have shaped races such as the Orsimer, Dunmer, and Bosmer. The empires of Cyrodiil flourished through Akatosh's protection. The Aelids came to power through deals with the Daedra. The Dunmer carved out a home of their own through the living tribunal of gods who only achieved their power through the heart of Lorkhan, who was also a god. The Dwemer disappeared because they tried to make a god. The civil war in Skyrim is partially happening because some say Talos is a god and some say he is not. Even the very geography of the lands has been shaped by gods. You cannot escape the reality of gods and religion in the Elder Scrolls. They are undeniably real. But as is often the case with the Elder Scrolls, reality is flexible. Things can change. Dragon breaks, Kim, etc. Look, the Elder Scrolls can be ridiculously complex, but it is my job here today to help simplify it all so you can digest it as one tidy, healthy meal. I will link down below videos that we've made that will be helpful in understanding this video, topics such as who are the Elnafey, Dragon breaks, and the Godhead. That aside, my name is Scott from Fudge Muppet, and this is the complete guide to gods in the Elder Scrolls. You see, there are gods, the Aedra and Daedra, but there are also many different interpretations and pantheons among the different cultures of Tamriel. This video is going to try and reconcile all the differences of the pantheons, explain the different ideas about creation, talk about the gods as planets and their power through worship, and then we'll get into a bit of the crazier bits like dragon breaks and retroactively changing the past, that kind of stuff. So I hope you can get comfy and you have a clear mind because this is going to get a little full on. I've made timestamps in the description to help break it up and make it easier for you to return to certain topics and sections. Let's get into it. We are going to begin with creation, the beginning of the universe. There are multiple different variations of this, but we need to get the gist to understand the fundamental nature of Mundus and the gods. At first, there were two ever-competing forces, order and chaos. These forces were called Anu and Padme, order and chaos, stasis and change, respectively. Now, these are not gods per se, but rather cosmic forces. This distinction is important because gods are a personification. They have an ego, a sense of self. They are an entity with agency. Cosmic forces, on the other hand, lack such agency. They act as they are meant to act. Anu, a force of order, fights against Padme, a force for chaos. There is no animosity between the two, they are simply forces that perform their function, in opposition to one another. However, these opposing forces were equal in power, resulting in a stalemate. Now, what happens next is that Anu ends up creating itself a soul, or kind of soul, and Padme does the same. These two pseudo-souls, as I like to call them, are Anoiel and Sithis. The reason I say pseudo-soul is because they aren't quite gods yet. They feel and behave more like cosmic forces in comparison to the gods that you would be familiar with, but they're halfway there. So it's easier to think of Anoiel and Sithis as the halfway points between cosmic force and god. They are the earliest concept of a somewhat conscious entity. With this ability to reflect and to be conscious of themselves, Anoiel and Sithis, instead of being relegated to fighting one another helplessly like the cosmic forces Anu and Padme before them, they could come to an agreement, a solution. They would create the Orbis, which is the name for the universe in the Elder Scrolls. But then, these two pseudo-souls create a soul each for themselves, a new incarnation, what we would consider the very first gods as we understand the term. Anoiel created Auriel, and Sithis created Lorkhan. Auriel and Lorkhan mark the transition fully from a cosmic force-type entity to a fully conscious entity, a personality, an ego, an actual god as we know them. The Orbis was crazy at the time, unstable and nonsensical, but then Auriel, in his first actions, decided to create the concept of time, which stabilized the universe. Time exists, but not necessarily in the linear way that mortals like you and I understand it. Consider the space-time continuum, how time functions differently in different places within our own universe. But since time created some sense of the universe, other entities or souls could be born. These are the original spirits called the Et Arda. The planes of Aetherius and Oblivion came into existence as well, as places for these Et Arda to inhabit. So I think it's time to recap. Anu and Padme exist. They are cosmic forces of order and chaos. They create themselves a pseudo-soul each, Anoiel and Sithis. Now these cosmic forces of order and chaos interplay and end up creating the Orbis, the universe. Anoiel creates itself a soul called Auriel, and Sithis does the same, creating Lorcan. Auriel creates time, stabilizing the universe, and then many more gods, aka the Et Arda, the original spirits, are born, as well as the planes of Aetherius and Oblivion. Cool, so we're all up to speed. Now what happens? Well, the multiple of the Et Arda were not entirely satisfied with the planes of existence they had to choose from, so Lorcan used this opportunity to enact his plan. Lorcan approached the Et Arda with the plan for creation of a new realm called Mundus, which they could fill with their own creations. Some of the Et Arda declined the offer. These were called the Daedra, which means not our ancestors, and the ones who did accept and took part in the creation were called the Aedra, which means our ancestors. Here is where the stories differ. As the elves tell the story, Lorcan is seen as a trickster and a betrayer who came to the gods and then told him of his plan, but kept secret the fact that they would lose parts of their power in the process. The realm of Mundus was formed, and within it the planet of Nirn, but spirits who took part in its creation did not realize until it was too late. Some of them, however, did realize what was happening to their power and chose to abandon the project of Mundus. Magnus, the architect, as well as his followers called the Magnagi, fled, ripping holes in the realm through to Aetherius. It is for this reason we have the sun and stars, which all leak magicka from Aetherius into the mortal realm. The most powerful of the Aedra, the ones that you would know as the 8 Divines, convened at the newly created Adamantine Tower and decided how they would punish Lorcan. There are a few versions of this, and time is also not exactly linear at this point, so I will just tell you the crux of it. Auriel ripped out Lorcan's heart and shot it into the sea, where the island of Vardenfell and Red Mountain would grow. The 8 Divines committed to the creation of Mundus and completed it, losing much more of their power and being reduced to the semi-unconscious states that they are in, as planets floating around Nirn. The other Aedric Et Arda, who were weaker than the Divines, were stuck on Nirn, and they became the Elnefey. Some sacrificed themselves to become the laws of nature and the elements that bound Nirn together, but then there were 2 other groups of Elnefey, the Old and the Wandering. The Old Elnefey found Aldmeris, a place they could fortify and protect, a place of order and calm, and live as they had before the creation of Mundus. These would become the Elves. The Wandering Elnefey, on the other hand, were left to a crazy, changing Nirn, confusing them and disorienting them. After Nirn was finished, they found themselves scattered with memories lost on all corners of this newly formed world. These would become the races of man. The fundamental difference between the elven interpretation I just spoke of and the interpretation of creation by man is the trickery. Let's look at Shazar, the Cyrodiilic version of Lorcan. It is said that Shazar came to the other Et Arda and taught them how to be mothers and fathers. He was honest about them losing their power, but brought the philosophy of sacrifice to create something beautiful, to create Mundus. The gods of man and beast joined the project and willfully gave birth to their creations, relishing in their sacrifice. However, the elven gods became bitter and disliked their lost power, and then turned on Shazar for revenge. The main difference between elves and man's opinion about the soul of Sithis, Lorcan, or Shazar, is whether or not he was a good and honest dude or a trickster and a liar. Okay, so we should all now be on the same page about the creation story. Whether or not Lorcan was a bad guy or good guy depends on really whether you are an elf or a man, but let's get back to the gods. We are going to tackle all different kinds of interpretations of the gods in the different pantheons, but first we need to clear up all of the hard facts and necessary distinctions, as well as the fundamental commonalities between them all. So, before creation, there was Anu and Padme, the cosmic forces which are always acknowledged in some form. For example, in the Yokudan pantheon, they are combined into Sakatal, the snake, the world skin, who has Nirn on his scales. But Satakal is shaped like an Ouroboros, always eating itself because of its hungry stomach, called a Kel, aka their interpretation of Padme. All of the gods were originally collectively called the Et Arda, the original spirits. Then exist 2 classifications as well as an extra little group. You have the Aedra, who gave up their power to create the realm of Mundus, and on the other hand, you have the Daedra, who sat back and watched from the waters of oblivion. keeping their power. Now, this is why the Daedra are far more powerful than the Aedra. It is why you have the Daedric princes still interacting with mortals, whereas the Aedric influence is subtle, rare, or limited. The Divines don't interact with you directly like the Daedric princes can. There is another group which are somewhat Aedric because they helped with creation, but they are also the ones who bailed halfway through the process, aka Magnus and the Magna Gi. The many different cultures of Tamriel almost always recognize a complete distinction between the Aedra and the Daedra, but then we also have the curious case of gods like Orki, who combines aspects of Malakath and Arche, but we'll get to him later. The gist is, because the Daedra have such visceral and personal interactions with the mortals of Nirn, they are rarely misinterpreted. Yes, they can take different forms, male or female, or perhaps they could appear more similar to the race they are speaking to, for example Shaggorath, the Sugar Cat, the Khajiit version of Sheogorath, but their spheres, what they are about, are generally understood, and they have a commonality in all religions of the Elder Scrolls. Hircine is the god of hunt in pretty much all cultures, and Mehrunes Dagon is the god of destruction. You get the idea. But the Aedra are a completely different story. They gave up much of their power during creation, and as a result they have been left somewhat comatose in an almost unconscious state. Each of the Aedra can be identified as one of the other planets within Mundus. As I said, they don't usually directly interact with mortals. They are usually limited to influence only. This disconnect between the mortals and the Aedric gods has made it so each culture can develop their own ideas about each god, and there is no god to just show up and say, nah, that ain't me. Whereas the Daedra can clearly interact with mortals and say, this is what I'm about. Therefore, cultures can't really impart their own beliefs onto the Daedra besides different names. This whole thing gets even more complex when we start talking about worship and multiple god identities, but we're going to leave that to later in the video. First, we are going to talk about the pantheons. Buckle up for a lot of religion. We're going to talk about all the gods of all Tamrielic cultures, so let's just begin with the foundational one, the one for our basis of comparison, the Imperial Pantheon. The beginning of the Imperial Pantheon, the beginning of the Aedra beings known as the Eight Divines, started with the slave queen Alesia, who began the first empire of man in Cyrodiil in the year 243 of the First Era. So what is interesting is that before this, there was no Zenithar or no Kinnereth. They went by other names, worshipped by other cultures, seen as different deities. The Imperial Pantheon itself is a First Era creation. For example, Kinnereth, the nature goddess, was known as Kine to the Nords and was the god of storms and warrior wife to Shor, who is their interpretation of Lorkhan. Anyways, the reason the Imperial Pantheon was created was to provide a middle ground between those who worshipped the Elven Pantheon, such as the liberated Nedic slaves, and also the Nords who helped them, who believed in their traditional ancient Nordic pantheon. Alesia combined aspects of both sets of gods to create a balanced interpretation. She is the reason that Auriel, the elven god of time, became Akatosh, the dragon god of time, because there is no way that the Nords would accept an elvish god. Now, big heads up right now, Akatosh is really confusing because at some point a group called the Marikati Selectives actually caused a dragon break, apparently, to remove the elven elements of Akatosh, but I don't want to get into that here, so you can go watch the Dragon Break video linked below, but also I will be talking about worship later, and this will be important then. I'm also not going to talk about Talos, the Ninth Divine, yet, but for now, we have the Imperial Pantheon, which consists of Akatosh, the dragon god of time, Arche, the god of cycles, birth and death, Debella, goddess of beauty and art, Julianos, the god of wisdom, logic and magic, Kinnereth, the goddess of heavens and nature, Mara, the mother goddess of love and compassion, Stendar, the god of mercy and justice, and finally we have Zenithar, the trader god of work, commerce and wealth. These 8 gods, these imperial interpretations of the divines that Empress Alesia created in the First Era, are the ones that you are most familiar with. There is also Shazar, considered the lost sibling of the divines, but remember, Shazar is the Cyrodiilic version of Lorkhan, and Lorkhan was killed, mostly. But the big interesting takeaway here is not a large pepperoni pizza from Domino's, but the fact that the imperial cult came much later than other interpretations and was a direct fabrication, taking common archetypes, which shows that the Imperials don't necessarily have it right. But the same goes for everyone. I thought that it might be a good idea to talk about the Nordic pantheon next, considering that you may be a little bit more familiar with some of the names from the limited mention in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. A more accurate term now would be the ancient Nordic pantheon, as it has been largely supplanted by the imperial versions of the pantheon in the Fourth Era. The ancient Nordic pantheon is far more Nordic in flavour, based around their warrior culture. Their greatest god is Shor, a bloodthirsty warrior king who sided with the Nords, bringing them victory against the Aldmeri oppressors. He is what you would consider chief of the Nordic gods, and it is Shor who created the ethereal realm of Sovngarde, a utopia for the Nords to enjoy in death after a good life. He was eventually killed by the elven gods. Kine, the goddess of the storm, is the Nordic variant of Kinnereth. Kine is one of the most important gods to the Nords. She is the warrior widow of Shor and also referred to as the Kiss at the End because she leads the souls of slain warriors to Sovngarde. She is also attributed with being the mother of man and instructing Paarthurnax to teach the Nords the Thum. You may start to see a trend here. Nordic gods usually have the Nords reflected in their interpretations, hence the many warrior gods. Now look at how they view Stendarr, the god of mercy. Their version is called Stun, the god of ransom. He was the shield thane of Shor and taught the Nords how to take prisoners of war and why it was beneficial. Stun's brother was Tsun, the giant guy that guards the whalebone bridge to Sovngarde. Junal, the god of hermetic orders, runes, language, and mathematics, also associated with magic and the clever men, is the ancient Nordic version of the divine Julianos. Mara of the Nordic pantheon is very similar to her imperial counterpart. In fact, most people of Tamriel include Mara as a god of love and marriage, making her the most universal god among the cultures. However, in the Nordic interpretations, she is considered to be the handmaiden of Kine. Dibella was also included as the goddess of beauty. Before Akatosh, the Nords considered that Adric entity to be Alduin, the World Eater. Alduin was seen as the god of time, both a creator and harbinger of their apocalypse. He's associated with Kalpas, and that it is said that he destroys the universe for it to begin anew. However, when we play Skyrim, we hear of Alduin as the firstborn of Akatosh, implying Akatosh and him are not one and the same, but I'm going to talk about that some other time. The final god of the ancient Nordic pantheon to talk about is Orki, the lone god of the Nords and god of mortality. This is one of the most curious cases where both Adric and Daedric elements have been conflated and combined into a single god. The Aedra Arche and the Daedra Malakath are both mixed to create this Nordic interpretation called Orki, the Old Knocker. Orki is said to be responsible for why the Nords don't live as long, and Orki's people are called the Orcs. Now, the simple way to solve this is to treat Orki as Arche, but associated with the Orcs, but not directly being Malakath as well. In Nordic stories, Orki is a bad guy, likely why they tossed in the Orcish elements to demonize him further and make for a more exciting story. But my reasons for believing that the Daedric prince is not actually involved in Orki is because they have another name for the Daedric prince called Morlock, the Orcish god. So the best way to look at Orki is the demonized version of Arche with some Orcish elements to make him seem more evil, but that is not implying that he is literally Malakath. Instead, Malakath is called Morlock, a separate entity. By now you have probably realized that religions and gods are incredibly complicated, and when you add in different interpretations, which pretty much always happen, you have a lot of work to do. Look at the real-world Abrahamic religions. They all have the same core god, with many different interpretations, prophets, or scriptures. You have the Jewish faith, the Christian faith with its many divisions, Catholic, Anglican, Protestant, and its orthodoxies, plus many more, as well as the Muslim faith with its many groups like the Shia and Sunni, plus the many, many more. Point is, all of these religions and interpretations all have the same root, talking about the same God of Abraham, but many different versions. In the same vein, all of the different cultures of Elf, Nord, Redguard, Imperial, etc. are talking about the same Adric entities, just very different versions. In one culture, the Aedra Stendarr is the god of mercy and justice. In another, he is the god of ransom. Anyways, let's move on to the Elven pantheon, where it gets a little more interesting, because the elves were once the old Elnefae, the ones who could maintain the calm and order in Aldmeris during the hectic changes of a newly born Nirn. The elves. One of the most important distinctions between man and elf is how they understand their own mortality. Men usually see it as a gift from the gods. They have been given life, and the elves usually see it as a prison, a trap set by Lorcan who robbed them of divinity. Fundamentally, the elves are very aware of their origins, once being Et Arda. Remember, the Et Arda were the original spirits. They lost their power during their creation of Mundus. The most powerful were the Aedra, but the others became the Elnefae. While the other Elnefae became part of Nirn, or the Wandering, the old Elnefae found Aldmeris, where they could create what would become Elven society, a place of calm and order, where history and memory could be preserved. Because elves are aware of their original forms as Elnefae, and before that, the Et Arda, the elves worshipped all of their ancestors. But after the Aldmer were lost from Aldmeris and found the Somerset Isles, they would soon begin exclusively worshipping only the greatest of their ancestors, creating elevated importance for them, becoming their gods. Now, this is one of the main reasons that the Chimer left the Somerset Isles, who would become the Dunmer. They today still venerate all of their ancestors, so it's important to remember that the elves consider all of the Aedra as their ancestors, which is what the word Aedra actually means, our ancestors. So greatest among them, their most important god, is Auriel, known by the races of man as Akatosh, but they kind of become separate. It gets fiddly, but let's stay on track. Auriel is the elven god of time and king of the Aldmer. Most Altmer and Bosmer claim direct ancestry from this god. There is Magnus, the architect of Mundus and god of magic, who fled at the last moment of creation, creating the sun. Trinimac, the strong god of the Aldmer, was Auriel's right-hand man and knight. He was eventually eaten by Boethia and transformed into the Daedric prince Malakath. Xerxes is the god of ancestry and secret knowledge, who began as a scribe to Auriel. He keeps track of all Aldmeri accomplishments, big and small. We also have Mara, goddess of love, but to the elves, she was the wife of Auriel. Stendar, god of mercy, is there, but in early legends he is seen as an apologist of men. There is also Sirabane, the god ancestor of magic, and also Finaster, the hero god of the Ultima. Of course there is Lorcan, seen as the betrayer and the missing god, but a very important god called Ifri, god of the forest and spirit of the now, is worshipped by the Ultima, Bosmer, Falmer, and Breton alike. Ifri was the first of the Elnefae, the first Earth Bones. Ifri was also the god who made the Green Pact with the Bosmer of Valenwood. So far I've talked about the Ultima gods, gods of the Somerset Isles, but there are some differences between the Bosmer and Ultima. The Bosmer worship many of the same gods, but they also worship Arche, like the Imperial version, god of birth and death, as well as a god called Zen, the god of toil, which is their version of the divine Zenithar. They also worship the moon gods, Joan and Jode, as well as Bandar, the bandit god. In addition, the Bretons with their elven heritage have a mix of both man and mer pantheons, generally aligning with the imperial cult's beliefs of the eight divines. I guess I ought to mention the other types of elves that fall outside the typical variations of the elven pantheon, the races of Mer that worship the Daedra. So the Orcs or Orsimer were Trinimac's ancient followers who were turned into Orcs when Boethia ate Trinimac and turned him into Malakath. As you would all well know, the Orcs worship their god, the Daedric prince, Malakath. Some, however, do hold on to the worship of Trinimac. The Chimer, who were led by the prophet Veloth, left the Somerset Isles with the help of what they call the Good Daedra, Boethia, Mephala, and Azura. The Chimer settled Morrowind and would continue their practice of ancestor worship, including worshipping parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., their family trees, essentially. But in addition, they worship the three Good Daedra. There are also four Daedra collectively called the Four Corners of the House of Troubles, which are to be placated and appeased rather than than worshipped. They are often considered the testing gods. They are Malakath, who tests for physical weakness, Sheogorath, who tests for mental weakness, Mehrunes Dagon, representing the inhospitable terrain of Morrowind, and Molag Bal, who tries to ruin the purity of Dunmeri bloodlines. Of course, there is also the millennia-long stint of the Tribunal of Living Gods. The Tribunal's defiance of the three good Daedra is the reason that the Kaima were cursed and transformed into the Dunmer, but since the end of the Third Era, the Dunmer have reverted to the worship of the good Daedra, being called the Reclamations, rather than the worship of the now dead or disappeared Almalexia, Vivec, and Sotha Sil. But with that aside, let's now move on to the two other pantheons of Tamriel that have particularly unique interpretations, beginning with the Yakutans, aka the race of man you know as the Redguards. If you are familiar with Redguard history, then you would know that they come from an entirely different continent called Yakuta, hence they have an entirely different pantheon of gods, yet many can be connected with the Aedric Divines. Now there is a distinction to be made. There are two political sides to Hammerfell, the Crowns and the Forebears. Crowns are more traditional and still worship the Yakutan pantheon, whereas the Forebears basically worship the Imperial pantheon with some Yakutan flavor, names and such. So let's begin with the Yakutan gods and draw all of the connections. So firstly, we have Satakal. I mentioned before that he is a combination of the original cosmic forces, Anu and Padme. He is also pointed out to be similar to Alduin in some respects. He is also called the World Skin because the worlds rest on his scales. Satakal is a serpent eating itself. Eventually it reaches its own heart, and that marks the end of the universe, but then it sheds its own skin and the universe begins again. Every time this happens, everything dies, and it begins again. However, this was until the spirit called Ruptga, also called Tall Papa, figured out a way to survive the process. This process was called Walkabout, and Ruptga set the stars in the sky to show the other spirits how to do the same. Ruptga, by the way, is the Yakutan version of Akatosh or Auriel. Eventually though, there were too many spirits to keep track of, so Ruptga creates Sep from the dead skin of the past worlds to help him regulate the spirit trade. Sep is the Yakutan version of Lorcan. Sep, being the dead skin of the serpent Satakal, is driven mad by its hunger, and in his madness, he convinces some of the gods to help him make an easier alternative to the Walkabout. This, of course, is the world as we know it, and the spirits who followed Sep become trapped here to live their lives as mortals. Sep is punished by Tall Papa for his transgressions, but his hunger lives on as a void in the stars, a non-space that tries to upset mortal entry into the far shores, which is the Yakutan afterlife. There are more nuanced details to this, but perhaps I will talk about them in another video. This video is already big enough. Next we have Tuwaka, the tricky god, Yakutan god of souls. Tuwaka, before the creation of the world, was the god of nobody really cares. Not my words, that's actually a direct quote from a book in-game. When Tall Papa undertook the creation of the Walkabout, Tuwaka found a purpose. He became the caretaker of the far shores, and continues to help Redguards find their way into the afterlife. Tuwaka's equivalent would be Arkay in the Imperial Pantheon. Zenithar is also represented as Zet, the god of farms. Morwa, the teat god, is the Yakutan fertility goddess, fundamental deity in the Yakutan Pantheon, and favourite of all Tall Papa's wives. Morwa is always portrayed as four-armed so that she can grab more husbands. Morwa is the same entity as Mara in other pantheons. Even her marriage to the time god is the same in the Yakutan Pantheon. Tava, the bird god, is the Yakutan equivalent of Kinnereth, and as for the rest of the gods, they don't exactly line up for comparisons to the 8 divines. Onsi is the Yakutan war god, Hunding, the make-way god, and one of Hunding's avatars, Diagna, is the Orichalc god of the sideways blade. There is also the saint of the sword called Leki, daughter of Tall Papa, whom they worship. So anyways, that basically sums up the Yakutan Pantheon. It's actually one of my favourite, and I would be keen to dedicate a video to all the nitty-gritty details, but right now we have to talk about the furry cat gods of the Khajiit. Now, Khajiit are a funny bunch. They don't conform to the 8 divines, and they don't draw strong lines between Aedra and Daedra. They also naturally, as cats themselves, interpret many of the gods as cat-like, as it is only natural. First important god, Alkosh, the dragon king of cats, and you guessed it, he is the Khajiit version of Auriel/Akatosh/Tall Papa. We also have Mara, the mother cat, wife of Alkosh, and like most interpretations of Mara, love, fertility, etc., that's all her sphere. Riddlethar is the sugar god, or the two moons dance, the cosmic order deity revealed to the Khajiit by the prophet Ridthar-Riddata, the Main. Riddlethar is more so a cosmic force or set of guidelines rather than a god, but then again, he has had avatars, so that implies some level of personification/godhood. You also have the moon gods Jode and Joan, who are very important and determine the very biology of the Khajiit through the lunar lattice. There is Srendar the Runt, the god of mercy, aka Stendar of the Imperial Faith. Kenathi, god of winds, is their version of Kinnereth. They also worship Bandar, the bandit god, like the Bosmer do. Rajin is the purring liar, the thief god, most famous burglar in history, who became worshipped as a god. Magrus is the cat's eye, the Khajiit version of Magnus, popular with magicians. Azura is the Daedra Azura, who in legends was involved in the creation of the Khajiit from elves. Shegorath is the skooma cat, mad god, and equivalent of Sheogorath. Hircine is the hungry cat, who is Hircine, the Daedric prince. Sengen, the blood cat, is the god of death and secret murder. Sengen's worship is hidden from Cat's eye, for who can control the urges of blood? Now, what is interesting is that by name he would seem to relate to the Daedra Sanguine, but secret murder and death seems to be more closely related to Mephala, but they know her as a separate entity. It's one of the stranger cases where the Daedra's interpretation actually differs substantially. There is also Namira, the Great Darkness, who is the enemy of the living. This is the Daedric prince that we know as Namira, but in their religion she takes on a significant role. Finally, Lorkhaj is the Khajiit version of Lorkhan, seen in a variety of ways, but not strictly good or bad, like men and elves view Lorkhan. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are the main pantheons of the many people of Tamriel, far more complex than just the 8 divines plus Daedra. As part of this complete guide, and in order to provide a preface understanding of how many different cultures view the gods, I had to explain the gist of each pantheon. The takeaway from this is to understand that the gods of the Elder Scrolls are not simply the 8 divines. Every interpretation is more or less valid because the gods cannot be truly known. The actual truth of the gods is hard to discern, and that may be because they are all true. We are about to get onto some intense topics of the metaphysical, so buckle up. We are going to be talking about worship and its functions, and with some theory, I'm going to help reconcile all of this information into a singular framework that makes sense. Okay, here is what we know. Within Mundus, there is a planet called Nirn, where Tamriel and all of the other continents are. There are also 2 moons, Massa and Secunda. There are also 8 planets, which are the bodies of the Aedra, the 8 divines. Now, these aren't literally the bodies, they aren't spheres, but this is how us mortals perceive them. Anyways, that isn't too important. Back to the planets. Now, for the intent and purpose of simplicity, I'm going to use the Imperial Pantheon as the baseline to describe each Aedra, even though other interpretations are potentially as valid. So as it stands, there are 8 planets: Akatosh, Arche, Debella, Julianos, Kinnereth, Mara, Stendar, and Zenithar. These entities exist, they are factual, but they don't necessarily exist as mortals interpret them, so keep this in mind. Now, all of these gods we have talked about are worshipped by someone. Gods want this worship. It makes them more powerful. So the more mortals that worship the god, the more power and influence they have. This is the fundamental reason why the Thalmor are trying to prevent Talos worship. Talos is real. His feats and accomplishments mark Tamriel. He changed Cyrodiil from a land of jungle into fertile grasslands. His aspect called Wolf appears in Morrowind, and his shrines give blessings. He is a factual entity, but by denying him, by telling people he is not real, by people ceasing to believe in him, his power wanes and he will eventually be insignificant. I will link a video down below about the Thalmor plot which goes into all of the intricacies, but I want to talk about worship. The Daedric princes, who remember are Daedra, which means not our ancestors, meaning they did not take part in the creation of Mundus, therefore they retained their power, have active minds and ego, they have agency, whereas the Aedra are somewhat unconscious, comatose, having given up much of themselves for creation. Because of this, they are interpreted in many different ways, as we have discussed. This is where worship has power. Imagine the planet, the entity, the Aedra itself, the essential core of what the godly being is. It exists. Now imagine each interpretation of that god as a personality. Now just for a moment, accept the idea that each entity has a multiple personality disorder, with each of its multiple personalities being an individual interpretation that is worshipped by mortals, made real by collective belief. For example, let's look at Stendarr. Stendarr in the Imperial Pantheon is the god of mercy and justice. In the Nordic Pantheon, he is Stun, god of ransom. In the Khajiit Pantheon, he is Srendar, the Runt, god of mercy, and in Elven pantheons, he is Stendarr, god of mercy and compassion, but also seen as an apologist to men. All of these interpretations are the multiple personalities of the same core being. They are all true. The belief in and worshipping of an interpretation would empower a certain personality. The interpretation can be imposed on the Aedric entity because it is unconscious, unlike the Daedra, which have a direct agency. The way in which the unconscious Aedric entity is worshipped affects how it behaves or which personality of the multiple is strongest. There are questions you may have now. For example, Martin Septim becomes an avatar of Akatosh and defeats Mehrunes Dagon at the end of Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. So then surely Akatosh as a dragon is the correct one. Well, consider this. Consider that chronologically, if we walk back to the beginning of the First Era, the idea of Akatosh the Time Dragon did not exist. Akatosh and the rest of the divines as a concept were created by Alessia after the Cyrodiilic rebellion of slaves. So if you went back to the start of the First Era, Auriel was the god of time. The Ultima, the Bosma, the Aelids, the Dureni, the Falmer, they all worshipped Auriel and only knew of him as such. I mean, you can actually find Auriel's bow, the very same bow used to shoot Lorkhan's heart into the sea, and also Auriel's shield. Surely this must mean then Auriel is the true version. Well, no, clearly not, because Akatosh appears at the end of the Third Era as a fiery dragon. It would seem that the truth of the matter is that they are both real, different interpretations / personalities which at different times in history have been worshipped more or less, making the Aedric entity more commonly take on the form it is believed to be. A very good example to look at is the idea of Lorkhan. By the Nords, he is known as Shor, and Shor created the ethereal realm called Sovngarde. Sovngarde is 100% real. We have been there in Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, so does that mean the Nords have it right? But what about all we know about Lorkhan? The Nords can't be right, can they? But then there is also the Far Shores of the Yakutan mythology, the Redguard afterlife, which is a real place and is ventured to as part of a quest in ESO. The caretaker of the Far Shores is Tuaka, the Yakutan version of Archae, but does that mean the Yakutan version is the correct one? Do you see the problem? We have evidence for the existence of multiple different gods from different pantheons, from different mythologies of different cultures that all simultaneously exist. The existence of Akatosh does not dismiss the existence of Auriel. The existence of Kyne does not dismiss the existence of Kinnereth. The existence of Shor does not dismiss the existence of Lorkhan. We are then forced to accept the fact that they are all true and all have evidence for their own interpretation's existence. Now, within the framework of Aedric entities with multiple personality disorder, this starts to make a lot more sense. Then when you consider that the worship of these personalities increases their power, things start to make even more sense. You may need a while to digest these ideas before we move on, but if you find this framework and way of thinking useful, then we may be ready to move on. But before we do, I will leave you with this interesting notion. If we accept the proposition to be true, then that means that mortals, through worship of certain interpretations, shape the gods and help determine how the gods use their Adric influence, which in turn helps shapes the events of Mundus. This notion comes with the realization that it is a two-way street. Mortals affect the gods through worship, and gods then affect mortals back. So if my society collectively begins worshipping the Adric entity Akatosh as a time dragon rather than an elven deity called Auriel, then eventually the Adric entity, the core of the god, will have the Akatosh personality take over, and the Auriel personality will diminish. This explains why, for example, that while Auriel seemed to be dominant throughout mythic history, the idea of Akatosh becomes dominant with the rise of the First Empire, and over time the personality shifts, but Auriel is still real, just a lesser part of the Adric entity. I hope this is making sense. I feel like I'm explaining the plot of the movie Split. It is for this reason that the truth of the Elder Scrolls is so hard to discern, because the nature of the universe itself is somewhat flexible. That, as well as an unreliable narrator, doesn't make it easy. Have a look at the Dragon Breaks video in the description. You'll see how spastic and free-flowing the Orbis can be. So in this section, we are going to further explore some crazy ideas, mainly revolving around retroactively changing the past. I think this will be best started off with an example that punctuates the case. We won't dive into Kim, but let's focus on the Adric entity of time that goes by many different names: Akatosh, Auriel, Ruptga, Alkosh. Originally, let's say this entity is worshipped as Auriel, the elven god. Using the framework I previously discussed, the elves worship Auriel, and this gives strength to the idea of Auriel, the interpretation, or the personality, you could say. Auriel exists, and so did the things he did, like using his bow to shoot Lorkhan's heart into the sea. Then comes along Alessia, and she comes up with the idea of Akatosh. She has a rebellion, starts an empire, and now you have a lot of people worshipping the same Adric entity of time, but they call it Akatosh, and Akatosh is a dragon. Akatosh is not elven. The Adric entity of time now has two interpretations, aka two personalities at the same time. The elves worship Auriel, and the men worship Akatosh. But the elves and men also believe in different mythological histories. The men believe that Akatosh with Shazar was willing to sacrifice themselves for creation, whereas the elves believe Auriel was tricked by Lorkhan, aka Shazar, into the scheme of creation. So which of these stories is correct? Well, before Akatosh there was only Auriel, so it would be safe to assume that the elven version is correct. Or are we safe to assume that? Over time, people worship Akatosh more and more. Auriel becomes less popular, and over 3 empires of man you have widespread Akatosh worship, making Akatosh the stronger personality of the Adric entity of time, as shown by his dragon avatar in the end of the Third Era, in Oblivion. But now you may say, well, it doesn't matter, the past is still the past. But what about Sovngarde then? You see, Sovngarde was created by Shor, the Nordic interpretation of Lorkhan, but Sovngarde is real. So doesn't that confirm Shor as the true interpretation, including his history and origins? But that doesn't line up with the others. Now I'm confused. I'm just kidding. The point I'm trying to make is that time isn't and can't be consistent. Certain things all had to have happened even if they contradict. And if you watched our videos on Dragon Breaks, you would know that this has happened in Elder Scrolls history. A weird situation where the time god spazzes out and the timeline splits into multiple scenarios, but is somehow reconciled and rejoined into a single timeline. This creates precedents for multiple versions of creation all being true simultaneously. So Lorkhan is a betrayer and trickster while also being Shazar, who taught the Aedra to become mothers and fathers, while also being Shor, who built Sovngarde and died fighting against the elves. What this all comes down to is the idea that perception is reality, but taken to a fantastical level. This means all perceptions, even the ones that exist at the same time, aka Auriel, Akatosh, and Ruptga, all real and all the time god at the same time. This whole idea is what gave birth to concepts such as Coda. Within the internal framework of the Elder Scrolls, things like Kim, Kalpas, Dragon Breaks, etc. can all ultimately lead to the conclusion that your own headcanon is true. The game is kind of canonized headcanon, if that makes sense. It's essentially what the Elder Scrolls are. They're timeless metaphors for fantastical imagination. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that is a good note to end on, and I hope what I presented you with is a somewhat satisfying conclusion. The framework of the Adric entities with multiple personalities reconciles the fact that there are multiple cultural versions of each god that are all proven to be real in some respect. And the existence of dragon breaks also allows for the reconciliation of multiple creation stories and mythological origins. It's easier to imagine multiple different truths or timelines or versions of reality all coming together and converging at a single point, and that is the games you play, where many truths exist, if even contradictory. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching all the way through. Please do give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Religion, mythology, and gods are some of my favorite topics in the Elder Scrolls, as well as other fantastical worlds of imagination, in addition to even real-life religions and mythologies. I am so grateful to be able to share this passion with you guys, and I'm very keen to see what you guys think in the comments below. Thanks again for watching this video. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.